Tonight we step back into a world where the gas lamps flickered against icy fog and the cobblestones of London streets groaned under the weight of frost. The year is 1895, a winter so cruel that even the great Thames froze along its edges, binding the city in silence and hardship. This is not the London of wealth and opulence you might imagine from Victorian novels, but the London of the forgotten poor, who clung to scraps of coal, meager loaves of bread, and the fragile warmth of hope, as the bitter cold gnawed at their bones. Before we descend fully into this chilling yet tender story, I'd like to pause for a moment to welcome you. If you're joining us tonight, whether from the quiet corners of the US, the soft hours of evening, in Europe, or perhaps from a distant part of the world entirely, I invite you to let me know in the comments. Where are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? It's always a joy to know how far and wide these stories travel, weaving us together across the world. And if you find yourself soothed by these tales, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. It helps this little storytelling corner grow, and it means I can continue sharing more journeys with you. So now find your comfort. Perhaps you are tucked beneath a blanket, the room dim and quiet with the faint hum of the night outside your window. Take a breath, ease your shoulders, and let the world soften. We are about to step back in time into frozen alleys, candlelit rooms, and the quiet resilience of those who faced the great frost of London with nothing but courage and determination. And so, let us begin. The first light of dawn struggled through the fog that winter morning, painting the roofs of London with a pale silver glow. Snow lay heavy on the slanted shingles of workhouses and tenement buildings, its weight bowing wooden beams and dripping frozen shards onto the streets below. The air was so still that even the sound of carriage wheels seemed muffled, softened by the thick quilt of snow and ice that blanketed the city. Down in Whitechapel, the narrow lanes were lined with tiny footprints. Bare feet, many of them, etched into the frost like ghostly impressions of children hurrying toward warmth they might never find. Smoke curled faintly from the chimneys of factories that never truly slept, though even those fires seemed subdued, struggling to push back against the cold that clawed at every surface. For the poor of London, the day began not with a warm breakfast, but with a search. Coal had grown scarce, and even scraps fetched a high price at the yards. Families sent children to scavenge along the edges of the streets, hoping for bits of wood or fallen charcoal from passing carts. Each breath hung in the air as a pale mist, and the city felt strangely hushed, as though waiting for the first cry of the hungry, or the creak of a frozen door swinging open. And yet, in this frozen silence, there was something else, too, a determination, quiet but enduring. A woman wrapped in a threadbare shawl pulled her son close, rubbing his hands with her own to keep him warm. An old man leaned on a cane, each step uncertain, but his eyes steady as he made his way toward the soup kitchen. In every corner, though hunger and cold pressed down like an iron weight, there was still life, still movement, still the stubborn spark of survival. The winter was merciless, but the people of London, poor as they were, knew how to endure. Inside the cramped dwellings of the East End, the frost did not stop at the door. Thin walls patched with scraps of wood or cloth trembled against the wind, and in many rooms, ice had crept across the inside of windows like white lace, delicate patterns formed by bitter air. Families huddled together on straw mattresses or broken wooden frames, pulling layers of rags, shawls, and coats over themselves, anything they could gather. Still, the cold found its way in, settling into bones and lingering in every breath. The morning meal, if one could call it that, was often nothing more than a crust of bread dipped in weak tea or watered-down broth. Mothers saved the larger pieces for their children, pretending they were not hungry, sipping only the hot liquid to ease the ache in their stomachs. The little ones knew, of course, they always knew, but they said nothing, learning from an early age that silence was its own form of kindness. Frost bit into the metal of iron bedsteads, so that children sometimes cried out when their skin brushed against it in the night. Buckets of water left by the hearth froze solid, and small hands struggled to break through the ice to fill cups. Washing was rare in these months, not only because water was hard, but because undressing in such air felt like stepping into knives. The chill clung to the body even after one dressed again, burrowing deep, as if it wished to remain. For many, warmth came only from the company of others. Families sat close, shoulders pressed, breath mingling in a cloud. Brothers and sisters held each other beneath shared blankets, and neighbors knocked quietly on doors to ask if someone might spare a glowing ember to start a fire of their own. A single coal carried carefully in a small tin could mean the difference between another night endured or another night lost. And yet, life went on. The streets outside were already calling with the promise of meager earnings for those who could work. Boys trudged to the markets, shouting in hoarse voices to sell newspapers, their fingers too stiff to fold the pages neatly. Girls queued with baskets, waiting for scraps at the butcher's, eyes wide with hope that a marrow bone or a sliver of fat might be thrown their way. Men who were lucky enough to have steady work rose before daylight, their breath steaming as they walked to factories, their boots crunching on snow that never seemed to melt. In the midst of all this, there was a strange, quiet rhythm. It was the rhythm of survival, measured not in wealth, not in comfort, but in small victories, a fire coaxed to life, a bowl of broth shared, a child lulled to sleep despite the cold. The winter of 1895 pressed against them all, but the city breathed slowly, patiently, enduring hour by hour. For many families, the day's greatest struggle began with a journey, the long, weary walk in search of fuel. Coal merchants had raised their prices, knowing demand was high, and the poor could rarely afford more than a few pounds at a time. Those who could not pay turned to scavenging, scouring alleys and ash heaps for fragments overlooked or discarded. The streets of London in that frozen January were lined with figures trudging under the weight of sacks, baskets, or simply hopeful eyes. Children, some no older than 6 or 7, carried chipped buckets or tins, their thin shoes leaking snowmelt into their stockings. They followed their parents to the yards where coal was sold, waiting in queues that stretched long into the day. The air was sharp with soot and frost, every breath stinging the chest, every cough rattling in the lungs. And for many, the return journey was crueler still. A small bundle of coal, precious as gold, was often so heavy that it left red marks on fingers and shoulders. Children staggered under the weight, stopping often to catch their breath, their faces pale against the gray sky. Sometimes the coal was stolen on the way home, snatched by desperate hands, leaving a family with nothing but tears and exhaustion. Others turned to gathering wood. Along the riverbanks, men pried loose bits of driftwood, their boots slipping on the icy stones. In back alleys, children searched for broken crates, old chair legs, even splinters of timber thrown out by shops. Nothing was wasted. A few sticks might provide enough warmth to keep frostbite from small toes through the night. Some, too, became scavengers of fire itself. A trick often whispered among neighbors was to follow the carts that delivered coal to wealthier homes. Children darted behind, snatching at fallen lumps from the road, stuffing them into pockets before being chased off. It was a dangerous game, for carters carried whips, and the police turned a blind eye to harsh punishments. Yet hunger and cold did not leave room for fear. When they returned, weary and shivering, the family gathered close around the little pile of fuel, treating it like treasure. A single coal set, glowing in the hearth, filled the room with both warmth and hope. It was not enough, not for long, but it gave them the strength to face another day. And in those moments, as the flames flickered against the cracked walls, there was a fragile peace, a reminder that even in the deepest winter, life's smallest comforts were worth every hardship. That winter, the great river itself seemed to surrender to the cold. Along its broad expanse, sheets of ice clung stubbornly to the banks, thick enough in places for children to tread upon, though the danger of breaking through was always present. The river, which usually carried the lifeblood of the city coal barges, fishing boats, cargo vessels, now moved sluggishly, choked by jagged floes that drifted like shards of broken glass. The usual bustling hum of river trade was muted. Bargemen stood on the docks, stamping their feet against the frost, staring at vessels trapped in ice. Some ships had been delayed for days. Their crews huddled aboard with dwindling supplies, smoke curling weakly from their chimneys. The air was filled with the muffled groans of ice pressing against wood, the sound carrying eerily across the mist. For the poor, the frozen river offered both peril and possibility. Young boys crept onto the ice to chip away at frozen fish caught near the surface, hoping to sell or eat what they could. Others searched for driftwood carried down from a priver, now trapped in icy fingers where it could be pulled free. But every so often, a cracking sound would echo, and the crowd would shout warnings as someone scrambled desperately back to shore. The Thames was never merciful, and in winter it was cruelest of all. Still, there was wonder in it, too. People from nearby neighborhoods gathered at the banks, marveling at the strange, frozen stillness of the great river. Children pressed their faces against the iron railings, their cheeks reddened by the cold, whispering that the world seemed to have stopped moving. Old men recalled the frost fairs of centuries past, when whole markets had been held on the ice. But in 1895 there was little festivity to be found, only hardship and a quiet reverence for the power of the season. At night the river looked like a stretch of moonlit glass, the ice glowing faintly under the pale sky. Gas lamps flickered along the embankments, their halos of light reaching out into the fog. And those who walked by the Thames at such hours felt a strange mix of awe and sorrow, as though the city itself were holding its breath beneath the grip of winter. Amid the biting winds and endless hunger, the soup kitchens became sanctuaries for London's poor. Scattered across the city, often set up by churches, charities, and the tireless efforts of a few kind-hearted souls. These small halls and cellars glowed faintly with the promise of warmth and food. Word of a meal spread quickly along the alleys. A pot is boiling, bread is being cut, come quickly before it is gone. The queues began before dawn. Men with hollow faces wrapped their scarves tightly, standing shoulder to shoulder with mothers who carried infants, swaddled in blankets. Children clung to their parents' skirts, their eyes wide, clutching tin cups or small bowls. The line stretched down icy streets, steam rising in faint clouds from every waiting breath. Inside the air was thick with the scent of broth. Thin, yes, but heavenly compared to the emptiness of a cold stomach. Volunteers ladled portions into chipped bowls, the liquid steaming, the bread coarse but filling. Each serving was modest, often no more than a ladle or two, yet it carried a weight far greater than its measure. For some, it was the only meal of the day. There was an odd sort of hush in these places, broken only by the scrape of spoons and the occasional cough. Families ate quietly, savoring every mouthful as though it were a feast. Children dipped their bread into the broth, eyes closing with relief at the warmth. Mothers smiled faintly to see their little ones eat, even as they took only a few bites themselves, saving the rest for later. For many, the soup kitchen was not just sustenance, but dignity. It was a reminder that someone somewhere still cared. A clergyman might walk among the tables, offering words of comfort. A woman serving bread might pat a child's head, tucking an extra piece into their hand when she thought no one noticed. Small gestures perhaps, but in the heart of such a cruel winter, they carried a warmth no fire could match. And when the bowls were empty, and the lines at last dispersed, those who had been fed stepped back into the freezing streets with a little more strength in their stride. The cold still bit, the hunger still lurked, but for a short while hope had been ladled into their lives, one steaming bowl at a time. Though the frost had stiffened the very bones of the city, the markets of London still stirred with life. Under the grey sky, rows of wooden stalls lined the squares and alleys, their awnings heavy with icicles, their tables dusted in snow. Vendors stood bundled in great coats, stamping their boots and blowing into their hands, their cries for trade muffled by scarves pulled tight across their faces. The goods on offer told the story of the season. Vegetables, turnips, cabbages, and onions were shriveled and frostbitten, their colors muted beneath a layer of frost. Potatoes stored in sacks were firm with cold, some already spoiled. Fishmongers displayed their catches upon frozen boards, the fish stiff as wood, their scales glittering faintly in the dim light. Meat was scarce, and what little there was, lay beyond the reach of the poor, guarded by butchers with sharp knives and sharper eyes. Yet for all its hardships, the market was a place of movement, of voices, of survival. Mothers haggled desperately for bones to boil, hoping to coax even the faintest broth for their children. Boys carried baskets, offering to run errands for a coin or two. Girls clutched tin pails, waiting for scraps of fat or suet that might be given freely once the wealthier customers had gone. Every sound carried through the cold air, the clatter of wheels, the crack of ice underfoot, the bark of traders, and the murmur of those who longed but could not buy. There was color here too, despite the bleakness. Red apples, though rare, gleamed against the white. A cart of oranges from the docks gave off a bright citrus scent that seemed almost magical in the frozen haze. Children pressed close, their noses red, eyes fixed on the fruit as though it were a glimpse of summer itself. Few could afford even one, but the sight alone brought a moment of wonder. And amid the bustle, acts of quiet kindness unfolded. A baker, seeing a shivering child near his stall, slipped him a broken roll too misshapen to sell. A flower girl, her blooms wilted from the cold, handed a drooping posy to an old woman with no money, whispering that perhaps the color might cheer her. These gestures, though small, softened the sharp edge of the market's struggle, reminding those present that even in the coldest season, humanity had not yet frozen. When the stalls at last closed, the snow carried footprints in every direction. Trails of longing and survival pressed into its pale surface. The market had given little, but for many it was enough to keep life moving one day more. No one felt the cruelty of that winter more deeply than the children. Their world was a mix of hardship and fleeting moments of play, shaped by both the bitter cold and the resilience of young hearts. In the narrow lanes of Whitechapel and Southwark, one could see them at dawn. Thin figures darting through the mist, their cheeks flushed with the sting of frost, their breath rising in clouds as they hurried about errands. Most wore shoes with holes that let the snow soak through, if they had shoes at all. Stockings were patched with twine, trousers too short to cover ankles, shawls wrapped around shoulders far too small. Yet they bore it with a toughness born not of choice but of necessity. Their laughter rang out even in the frozen streets, carrying like a defiance against the season. Work claimed many of them. Boys sold newspapers at the corners, their voices hoarse from shouting headlines into the cold air. Others ran messages for pennies, carrying notes between households and shops, their fingers so numb they fumbled the folded paper. Girls stood in queues outside bakeries and butchers, clutching coins in mittenless hands, waiting for scraps of food. Some carried baskets to wealthier homes, returning with tips that helped feed their families. Childhood, in such winters, was a fragile luxury, and yet, when the rare chance came, they found play even in the frost. A patch of frozen mud became a slide, where giggles echoed as they tumbled down together. Snow, when it fell thick enough, turned into ammunition for battles fought in alleys. Their bare hands red from the cold, but their spirits brightened by the game. Even hunger could not wholly erase the spark of joy that flickered in young eyes. But behind every laugh was a shadow. Illness spread quickly in the damp air, coughs that deepened into rattling chests, fevers that burned even in the chill. A child's health was delicate, and many did not endure. Mothers held their little ones close at night, whispering stories and songs to soothe them, praying that morning would bring not silence, but another breath, another day. The children of the frost bore more than their share of suffering, and yet in their small hands and bright eyes, one could also see the city's greatest strength, the stubborn will to endure, to live, and to find joy, even when the world seemed frozen against them. When the sun dipped below the horizon, and the city's lamps flickered to life, the winter took on a new character. By day, the cold was harsh, visible in the shivering of bodies and the hunger carved into faces. But by night, in the cramped tenements of London's poor, the cold became something heavier, more suffocating, an unwelcome guest that pressed into every crevice of the room. The tenements were vast, decaying structures, often meant for far fewer souls than they held. Families crowded together in single rooms, their belongings stacked against damp walls, the plaster cracked and dark with mildew. The ceilings leaked and the floors creaked with every step, but these were not the greatest burdens. The true misery came from the air itself. The moment one blew out a candle, frost seemed to creep closer, shadows growing long and still, the silence broken only by coughing fits and restless stirrings. Most fires, if they could be coaxed to life, burned low and quickly. A handful of coal, carefully rationed, might warm the room for an hour before fading to embers. Families gathered close to capture every drop of heat. Children pressed against their mother's side, fathers pulling blankets over shoulders already covered with coats. The sound of chattering teeth often filled the dark, mingled with sighs as sleep was chased, but rarely caught. The smells of the tenement night were as vivid as its sights. The acrid smoke of a smoldering fire, the damp musk of wet rags hung up to dry the faint sourness of spoiled food hidden in a corner save because it could not be thrown away. Every breath felt weighted with these scents, heavy in lungs already weakened by the chill. And yet there was something human in this closeness, bodies pressed together, not only to share warmth, but to remind each other that they were not alone. Sounds carried easily through the thin walls. A baby's cry echoed from a neighboring room, met with soft shushing. The rumble of a man's cough shook the boards, each one deep and wet, a reminder of sickness lurking everywhere. Somewhere above the steady thump of boots could be heard as someone paced, too cold or too worried to rest. Below, a muffled quarrel broke out, voices rising with desperation before falling again into silence. The building itself seemed alive with its many sufferings, breathing in rhythm with the lives it contained. Sleep came fitfully. When it arrived, it was laced with dreams of warmth, of roaring fires, of heavy blankets, of kitchens filled with roast meats and golden bread. But too often the dream was broken by a draft that crept under the door, or a shiver that ran through the body. In some rooms, parents lay awake long into the night, watching over children, afraid of what the morning might bring if the little one's breathing grew weaker. And yet, even in such darkness, there was tenderness. A mother would tuck her child's hand into her own to keep it from the air. A father, returning late with only a crust to offer, would break it into smaller pieces so that each child might believe they had been given a share. Families told quiet stories, sang whispered lullabies, or recited prayers, not only to comfort, but to keep the silence from swallowing them whole. Outside, the city groaned in its frozen sleep. Snow fell in faint flakes, settling on roofs and railings, muting the sounds of the night. And within those weary rooms, London's poor lay waiting for morning. Another day of struggle, another day of endurance, another chance to find hope where little seemed to exist. Morning in the frozen city brought not only the bite of cold, but the pressing weight of survival. For countless men and women of the East End, the day began with the same task, the search for work. Without wages, there was no food, no coal, no chance of enduring the relentless winter. And so long before dawn painted the sky, the streets were already filled with figures trudging toward the docks, factories, and yards. At the great riverfront, hundreds gathered in the gray light, their breath rising in clouds as they waited for foremen to appear. The docks, where ships from across the world unloaded their goods, were both a source of hope and despair. Work was given only to a few, chosen at random, their names shouted above the crowd. The rest turned away empty-handed, shoulders slumped beneath the weight of disappointment. It was a cruel lottery. Some went home with coins to feed their families, while others faced another day of hunger. Factories, too, were crowded with hopefuls. The smell of smoke and iron filled the air, as men queued at gates, caps in hand, hoping for even the dirtiest, most backbreaking labor. Women stood nearby, clutching shawls against the wind, waiting for positions in laundries, match factories, or sewing rooms. Most would be turned away, the overseers waving them off with a curt shake of the head. But still, they came day after day, because to stop trying was to give up entirely. Even the children were part of this search. Boys offered themselves as errant runners or bootblacks, their voices hoarse as they called out services to strangers. Girls sought work in kitchens or as maidservants, standing anxiously at the doors of wealthier homes, waiting to be judged by appearance alone. Many were refused outright, but some returned with pennies or scraps of food, their faces glowing with the pride of contribution. The desperation was palpable. Men argued fiercely for positions, voices rising above the hiss of steam, and the clatter of wagons. Fists sometimes flew, though more often the fight was silent, an inward battle against despair. A man might wait in the cold for hours, knowing all the while that he would likely return with nothing. Yet still he waited, because what else was there to do? And through it all, the cold never released its grip. Feet went numb, hands cracked and bled, breaths came sharp and ragged. Hunger gnawed at stomachs, even as the body labored. But if one was lucky enough to earn wages, even the smallest, there was relief at the end of the day. A loaf of bread, a few lumps of coal, perhaps even a candle to light the room. These little victories kept families alive, reminding them that though winter was merciless, there was still a path forward, step by weary step. As the frost deepened its hold on the city, illness crept like a shadow through the narrow alleys and crowded dwellings. The cold was not merely uncomfortable, it was dangerous, feeding the spread of sickness that thrived in damp, airless rooms where dozens huddled together. Coughs echoed endlessly in the tenements, harsh and rattling, until it seemed the very walls had learned the sound. Bronchitis, pneumonia, and influenza were the cruel companions of the poor. Children's small lungs struggled against the damp, their tiny bodies racked with shivers that no blanket could soothe. Mothers placed warm cloths against their foreheads, boiled herbs when they could, and prayed softly into the night as fevers burned. Many had seen neighbors lose little ones in winters past, and so each cough, each labored breath filled the heart with dread. Hospitals were few, and charity infirmaries often overcrowded. Long lines of the sick formed at their doors, waiting in the icy air for a chance at care. Inside, beds were scarce, doctors overwhelmed, and medicines scarce. Those with means could summon a physician to their home. But for the poor, healing often rested in home remedies passed down through generations. Mustard plasters for the chest, onion broth for the throat, vinegar rubs for fevered skin. Some helped, many did not. But the effort itself carried hope. The old were especially vulnerable. Men who had labored on docks or in factories for decades now found their bodies betraying them. Their coughs deep and ceaseless, their strength too thin to fight back. Wrapped in coats threadbare with age, they sat silently by the fire, eyes weary but unyielding. Their children and grandchildren cared for them as best they could, though often it was little more than a shared cup of broth or a hand held tightly through the night. And yet amid the sorrow, there were moments of resilience. Neighbors shared remedies with one another, pressing herbs, teas, or a spoon of honey into grateful hands. Women nursed not only their own children, but the children of those too sick to rise from their beds. A single apple sliced carefully into thin wedges might be shared among 3 or 4. The freshness, a small act of healing. The winter of 1895 was remembered not only for its biting cold, but for the wave of sickness it carried. But even here, in the midst of fear and fever, the poor of London showed their quiet courage. They endured with tenderness, with care, with the fragile but stubborn belief that if one could make it through the night, perhaps the morning would bring just enough strength to carry on. As night fell over Victorian London, the city was transformed. The streets, once a flurry of desperate movement, became quiet under the hush of snow and fog. Within the tenements, homes were illuminated by the soft flickering glow of candles and oil lamps, their light dancing across cracked walls and soot-stained ceilings. In the harsh cold, even the smallest flame became a sanctuary, a tiny sun warding off the dark. Families gathered close to these fragile lights. The mother, seated on a worn wooden stool, held her youngest on her lap, rocking gently as the flame cast shadows across their faces. Children clustered on straw-stuffed mattresses, eyes wide with wonder at the golden glow, while older siblings whispered softly about the day's adventures and misadventures. Every movement had to be careful. One careless nudge could send the candle tumbling, and with it a momentary warmth might vanish. The smells of the evening were muted, but rich. The faint scent of burning tallow mingled with the acrid smell of damp wood, and the lingering aroma of the day's meager meals. Some homes had stew, bubbling slowly on a hearth, the liquid thick and dark, carrying the savory promise of nourishment. Others relied on bread toasted near the candle flame, crisp and dry, but comforting in its familiarity. Even in poverty, these small comforts were treasured, giving a sense of normalcy amidst hardship. Stories were often shared during these candlelit hours. Fathers told tales of London's bustling markets, of ships from faraway lands, or of winters past when frost fairs lined the frozen Thames. Mothers sang quiet lullabies, their voices trembling but gentle, lulling children into sleep with the rhythm of hope. Sometimes the tales were of survival, how to coax a fire back to life, how to gather enough coal to keep toes from freezing. But even these lessons were softened by warmth and love. The candlelight also highlighted the resilience etched into every face. Lines of worry and fatigue were softened by smiles and tender gestures. Hands cracked and red from the cold were clasped together in warmth. Eyes weary from labor and hunger still sparkled as children do when they hear a story for the first time. In these small golden pockets of light, the harshness of the world seemed to recede, replaced by the quiet strength of family and community. Evenings in the tenements were long. stretching as the frost crept in beneath doors and through the cracks of walls. But in every candlelit room, the poor of London clung to warmth, both literal and metaphorical, nurturing hope in the smallest of flames. It was here, in the gentle glow and whispered words, that hearts found comfort enough to endure another day of winter's cruelty. In the heart of every poor household, the hearth was sacred, though often small and struggling to hold a fire. It represented warmth, security, and a fragile sense of control over the merciless winter. A single ember could transform the room, chasing shadows from corners and allowing families to gather near, pressing together to share both body heat and comfort. Fuel was precious. Coal, gathered after long walks or purchased at great cost, was rationed carefully. A handful might be burned for a few hours, just enough to warm the air around the stove or fireplace, while scraps of wood or cardboard were added sparingly to keep the flame alive. Mothers taught their children to move with care, to blow gently on the coals rather than breathe too near and extinguish them. Every flicker of orange light was a victory, every moment of heat a relief from the gnawing cold. The hearth provided more than warmth, it created a rhythm for the day. Pots of thin broth were set atop it, simmering slowly, the aroma curling upward and filling the small rooms with a sense of sustenance. Clothes damp from the snow were laid near its edge to dry, taking on the faint smell of smoke and ash. Even the simplest actions kneading dough, stirring a pot, mending a torn sleeve were infused with purpose. Each small motion, a statement of survival against the winter that sought to consume them. Children clustered near the flames, rubbing numb fingers together, their faces glowing in the firelight. They listened intently as parents whispered stories of past winters, of places where warmth seemed endless, of heroes who endured hardship with courage. In these moments, imagination acted as a shield, allowing minds to wander to brighter, safer places. Even as the cold pressed relentlessly against walls and windows, the hearth also held a sense of community. In shared buildings, neighbors would sometimes knock to ask for a bit of warmth, to borrow an ember to rekindle a dying fire. And when a fire finally burned low, families drew closer together, huddling beneath blankets, their bodies a shared refuge against the cold. Even the smallest ember could foster a sense of solidarity, a reminder that they were not alone in enduring the merciless winter of 1895. As night deepened and the world outside seemed to freeze solid, the hearth's fleeting warmth became a sanctuary, a place where hearts and bodies could rest, however briefly, before facing another day. It was in this soft glow, and in the steady rhythm of survival, that the poor of London held on to hope. Outside, London lay shrouded in its familiar winter fog, thick and heavy, curling around lampposts, buildings, and the frozen cobblestones. The air was damp, carrying the scent of smoke, soot, and the faint sour temps of refuse left in alleyways. Visibility was low. Gas lamps cast halos of dim light that barely penetrated the mist, leaving the streets feeling both mysterious and threatening. People moved cautiously. Men trudged to work, boots crunching on frost-hardened snow and slush. Women clutched their skirts, eyes fixed on the ground, balancing parcels or baskets as they navigated puddles glazed with ice. Children followed, small hands gripping their parents' fingers. Little faces pressed into scarves that muffled both warmth and sound. The fog swallowed voices, so that even shouts or laughter became distant echoes, lending the city an almost dreamlike quality. In these streets, danger and opportunity mingled closely. Pickpockets thrived in the mist, hands swift and unseen, while beggars emerged from shadows, offering trembling hands and hollow eyes in hopes of spare coins. Vendors called softly, their cries barely audible above the hush of the fog. Horse-drawn carts moved slowly, bells tinkling faintly, wheels skidding slightly on frozen ruts. Every step was measured, cautious, a small negotiation between survival and hazard. Yet even in the gray, damp air, life persisted. Children left small footprints in the icy slush, running briefly to throw snowballs or chase one another, their laughter a faint bell in the muted city. Neighbors exchanged quiet words as they passed, offering scraps of advice, news of cold deliveries, or simple words of comfort. Windows glowed with candlelight here and there, promising warmth and food, each a beacon for the weary. The fog had a way of making the familiar, strange. A lamppost might appear as a giant among shadows, a horse's breath hanging in the air like smoke, or a doorway hidden until one was nearly upon it. And yet, for those who endured the streets daily, it became another challenge to master, another element to survive, to navigate, and to respect. As evening approached, the fog thickened, muffling even the faint clatter of carts and footsteps. Families hurried home, following lanterns or the dim glow of hearth fires. Each step a reminder that safety and warmth were treasures worth every effort. Outside, the streets of London were silent but alive, a frozen labyrinth of endurance, mystery, and quiet beauty under the gray winter sky. In the midst of the fog and frost, street vendors braved the merciless cold, their livelihoods hanging on a delicate thread. Each morning, before the sun had risen, they carried heavy baskets or pushed carts laden with bread, vegetables, or trinkets, their breath steaming in the icy air. Their fingers, often bare or protected by thin gloves, turned red and cracked as they handled goods, exchanged coins, and tried to maintain some semblance of cheer for passing customers. The city was unforgiving. Snow and ice made the road slippery, and carts could become stuck, requiring a man to heave with all his strength to free them. Some vendors trudged long distances from markets to more affluent neighborhoods, hoping to sell what little they had. The risk was great, coins were scarce, and the chance of returning home empty-handed after hours of exposure to the cold was all too real. Yet, persistence ruled the streets. Women carried small bundles of baked bread, calling softly, coaxing passersby to spare a penny for a loaf. Men sold vegetables scraped from frostbitten fields, speaking kindly to mothers who lingered, hoping for even the smallest portion. The exchange was more than commerce. It was survival, a delicate balancing act where every coin might mean warmth or hunger for a family waiting at home. Children sometimes accompanied their parents, their small forms shivering but resilient. They held signs, called out the goods, or simply clung to their parents' coats, learning early the harshness of work and the importance of perseverance. Every face was etched with both fatigue and determination, a reflection of a society pressed to its limits by winter's grip. Despite the struggle, there were moments of human warmth amid hardship. Vendors would share a scrap of bread with a child, or a neighbor would pass along a hot drink to someone shivering by the roadside. These small acts, gestures of kindness in a bitter world, reminded everyone that survival was not only about endurance, but also about compassion. As the day drew on, and the streets became slick with melting snow or refrozen ice, the vendors pressed onward. Every step was a challenge, but every coin earned and every sale made brought a tiny reprieve from the cold. In the city of fog and frost, their resilience was a quiet testament to the human spirit, a reminder that even in the bleakest winters, life and hope persisted. Even amidst hunger and hardship, the children of Victorian London found ways to carve moments of joy from the frozen streets. When snow fell thick and soft, the alleys and squares became playgrounds, their harsh surfaces softened by the white blanket. Small figures darted and tumbled, their scarves and coats wrapped tightly, faces red from cold and laughter alike. Games were simple but imaginative. Children slid along frozen puddles, pretending they were ice rinks, their squeals carrying through the narrow lanes. Snowballs flew in careful arcs, rarely hard enough to hurt but enough to spark shrieks and laughter. Tiny hand-shaped figures from the snow rudimentary snowmen, forts or animals, and fought to guard them from siblings or friends who tried to topple the creations in playful mischief. Even the poorest children made do. A scrap of cloth or a broken wooden toy could become a prized possession, transforming a simple game into an adventure of daring. Imagination was their ally, turning frozen barrels into castles and narrow alleys into kingdoms of make. Each day, their laughter rang like music across the frost-laden streets, a brief but vital respite from the cold and hunger that pressed relentlessly upon them. But winter's shadow was never far. Hands grew numb, toes stiffened, and a parent's call often pulled them back from play to the warmth of home. Yet those few hours of freedom mattered immensely. Children carried the memory of laughter and fun as a shield against the harshness waiting beyond the door. Even the faintest moments of delight became fuel for endurance, a reminder that joy could exist alongside suffering, and that the resilience of youth was unyielding even in the most trying conditions. As dusk approached and the light waned, the children returned to their homes, cheeks flushed, hair dusted with snow, breath visible in the dim glow of candlelight. Their small triumphs in the frozen streets were fleeting, but precious moments were imagination, and warmth briefly triumphed over the bitter grip of London's winter. In the frozen heart of London, access to clean water was one of the most relentless struggles of winter. Water carriers, often men and boys, walked the streets with heavy barrels slung on their backs or pulled on small handcarts, delivering life-sustaining water to homes and businesses. In 1895, the cold made every journey an ordeal. Pipes froze, wells were clogged with ice, and every drop had to be carried from the source to the door. The barrels were cumbersome and slick with frost. Each step required careful balance, for a slip on icy cobblestones could ruin the day's work, or worse, result in injury. Steam rose from the liquid as it was poured into pails and basins, creating brief clouds that clung to faces and hair. Hands, even when gloved, went numb quickly, and carriers often had to pause to rub them raw, their skin cracking against the chill. The weight of the water was more than physical. It carried responsibility. Many families depended on a single delivery for cooking, washing, and drinking. A missed day could mean cold, dirty water, or no water at all, forcing households to melt snow or beg for scraps from neighbors. Carriers knew this, and despite frostbitten fingers and aching backs, they pressed on, trudging for miles through slush and ice. Alongside the struggle, there were small moments of humanity. A neighbor might lend a hand to steady a barrel, or a child would run alongside, carrying a small bucket to ease the burden. Occasionally, a passerby tossed a coin or a scrap of bread, an acknowledgement of the grueling labor undertaken daily. These gestures, though minor, reminded carriers that their work was valued and vital, a lifeline in the frozen city. By evening, when the last barrels were emptied and the carriers returned home, their bodies were stiff and aching. Yet there was satisfaction in having fulfilled a crucial role, in having brought warmth and sustenance to others. In the freezing winter of 1895, water carriers were unsung heroes, their quiet perseverance sustaining countless families through nights where frost and hunger threatened to overwhelm. Among the shadows of London's freezing streets, charity offered a faint but vital glimmer of hope. Churches, small charitable societies, and devoted volunteers worked tirelessly to provide what little warmth, food, and clothing they could spare. Though their resources were limited, their efforts became lifelines for many families struggling to endure the harsh winter of 1895. At dawn, church bells rang through the fog, signaling the opening of charity halls and kitchens. Doors creaked as people entered, shaking off snow and frost, their faces pale and drawn from sleepless nights. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of boiled potatoes, stews, and bread baking slowly over modest stoves. Even a single slice of bread or a small ladle of broth could lift spirits, offering a rare sense of relief in a world dominated by hardship. Volunteers moved quietly among the visitors, tending to children and the sick, offering blankets or extra portions where they could. Their presence was more than service. It was comfort, a reminder that someone cared enough to notice. Mothers clutched infants to their chests as they received small packages of clothing, and fathers exchanged grateful nods with the ministers distributing coal or firewood. Each gift, though modest, felt monumental to those who had little else. The charity halls were also places of connection. People shared news of coal deliveries, tips for surviving frostbite, and warnings about the ice along the Thames. Children played quietly in corners, their laughter soft against the hum of conversation, while the elderly exchanged stories of winters past, passing wisdom through words that blended caution with hope. Even in the bleakness there was a sense of community, a network of care that bound strangers together. And as the day faded into evening, families left with small bundles of sustenance, hands filled with kindness, hearts carrying reassurance. The streets outside remained cold and unforgiving, but charity had lit a spark, a reminder that in the midst of winter's cruelty, compassion endured. For those who had nothing, it was a precious flame, fleeting perhaps, but enough to fuel endurance through another night of frost and struggle. While children and workers faced a biting cold and daily labor, the elderly bore a quiet, enduring struggle. Many had spent decades toiling in factories, docks, or workshops, their bodies worn and weakened, their savings meager or non-existent. In the winter of 1895, the frost seemed particularly merciless to those whose bones ached with age and who could not muster the strength to keep the cold entirely at bay. Most elderly residents lived in cramped tenements, often alone or with a single relative. The rooms were drafty, walls cracked and thin, offering little protection from the wind that howled through narrow alleys. Fires were small, coal scarce, and often enough the old would ration their heat, sharing blankets or surrendering warmth to children or younger family members before tending to themselves. In such moments, survival was an act of selflessness. Their mornings were slow and measured. Each movement rising from a low cot, tending a fire, preparing a small breakfast was done with care, mindful of fragile joints and numb fingers. Meals were meager, a slice of bread, a small bowl of porridge, perhaps a few scraps of vegetables or meat left over from charity kitchens or neighbors' generosity. Every mouthful was savored, a small shield against hunger. Yet despite hardship, the elderly carried wisdom and quiet resilience. They knew the patterns of the city, where to find warmth, how to coax a fire from fading coals, and which alleys were safest from frostbitten puddles. Children often listened in awe to their stories, tales of winters past, of frost fairs on the Thames, of kindnesses shown and hardships endured. Their memories became a bridge connecting generations, offering lessons in endurance and patience. At night, when the world grew silent and the wind rattled against thin window panes, many elderly huddled under layered blankets, praying that sleep would come without pain, that frostbite would not claim another finger or toe. Though their suffering was quiet, it was profound, a testament to the harshness of winter and the perseverance of those who had lived long enough to see it year after year. And still, amid the cold and fatigue, they found moments of comfort, a neighbor's visit, a shared fire, the warmth of a child's hand held gently in theirs. Before the sun had fully risen, the markets of London were transformed into stark, frozen landscapes. Stalls were dusted with frost, vegetables glimmered with ice, and the faint steam from fishmongers' counters hung in the air like ethereal ribbons. Merchants arrived early, bracing against the chill, their breath rising in clouds, fingers stiff, as they unpacked goods and called out their wares. For the poor, these early hours were crucial. Mothers and fathers navigated icy streets with baskets or tin pails, hoping to acquire something, anything, that could feed their families. Turnips, cabbages, and carrots, bruised and frostbitten though they were, became prized treasures, Small portions of bread, broken or slightly stale, were coveted for the warmth they could provide when baked near a hearth. Every item, however humble, carried significance far beyond its cost. The merchants themselves faced hardship. Carts creaked under the weight of frozen goods, and frost bit at faces and hands. Many had few customers in the bitter cold, their voices raised in hoarse calls that often went unanswered. Yet they persevered, driven by necessity, a delicate balance between sustaining their livelihood and facing the day's frozen trials. Amid the frozen stalls, children darted between legs, hoping for scraps or small coins. Their movements were cautious, careful not to slip on the ice that glazed the cobbles. Every small success, a stolen piece of bread, a coin dropped by a distracted shopper, was celebrated quietly, a tiny triumph in a world defined by scarcity and frost. The markets at dawn carried both struggle and fleeting beauty. Sunlight, when it broke through the gray clouds, glinted on ice-coated vegetables and silver scales of fish, creating moments of quiet wonder. Steam rising from hot tea or porridge mingled with the crisp air, lending warmth and aroma to the frozen scene. In those moments, for all the suffering, there was a reminder that life persisted, that survival demanded both endurance and hope, and that even the harshest winter could not fully extinguish the spark of vitality in London's streets. Beyond coal, firewood was one of the most sought-after commodities during London's bitter winter of 1895. Families scavenged for every splinter they could find, knowing that even a small bundle could stave off frostbite for a few precious hours. The search often took them into alleys, abandoned yards, and along the edges of the Thames, where driftwood and discarded crates offered the only chance of warmth. Men and boys carried heavy branches on their shoulders, snow clinging to their coats, while women balanced smaller bundles in baskets or tin pails. Each step was measured, careful of the ice that threatened to send them sprawling onto the frozen streets. Fingers cracked and bled, despite gloves, and the bitter wind cut through layers of clothing, chilling bodies to the bone. Yet they pressed on, knowing that warmth was a necessity, and that each piece of wood could make the difference between comfort and suffering. At times, the search required negotiation or even stealth. A crate left behind by a shop might be claimed quickly before someone else noticed, and neighbors sometimes exchanged scraps to ensure every household could keep a small fire burning. Children learned early to distinguish the safest pieces, selecting dry twigs that would spark quickly and leave longer-lasting embers. Every ember was treated like gold, coaxed into life with gentle blowing, covered carefully to preserve its glow. When firewood was finally brought home, the act of lighting the hearth became almost ceremonial. Sparks leaped from flint or coal, smoke curling upward as the flames began to dance. Families gathered close, faces illuminated by the glow, hands stretched to capture every ounce of heat. Even a small fire transformed the room, casting away shadows, warming stiff joints, and creating a fragile sense of safety. Though fleeting, the warmth brought by firewood was more than physical. It was emotional sustenance. It reminded families that they had endured, that their efforts mattered, and that life continued despite the cruel frost outside. In those quiet moments, huddled near the hearth, the people of London's poorest neighborhoods found both solace and hope, ready to face another day of the merciless winter. In the relentless cold of London's winter, frostbite became a silent creeping threat, claiming fingers, toes, and sometimes entire limbs of those least protected. The poor, often clad in thin shoes and wrapped in layers too light to fend off the wind, were the most vulnerable. Hands turned pale and stiff within minutes of exposure, ears reddened and burned painfully, and noses became raw and blistered. Those who worked outdoors, dock laborers, street vendors, water carriers, felt the frost's cruel grip daily. Fingers that once handled coins, rope, or tools became numb, painful, and unusable. Boys selling newspapers or delivering messages risked their small hands to the frozen air, learning quickly to press them against their bodies or warm them in steaming cups of tea, if available. Each moment outside was a negotiation with the cold, a careful dance to avoid permanent damage. Inside, the tenements offered little reprieve. Drafts swept under doors and through broken windows, chilling beds and blankets. Mothers often tucked children close, rubbing their hands and feet to restore warmth, but the cold was insidious. Even the warmth of a hearth or a thin fire could not fully penetrate stiffened extremities, leaving lingering pain and weakness. The community responded with small, tender measures. Neighbors shared thick woolen gloves, wrapped each other's hands in rags, or offered additional blankets to those most affected. Doctors, when available, advised the careful application of warm water and gentle massage, though such treatments were often hard to access for the poorest families. Still, even these small acts provided a lifeline, staving off the worst consequences and reminding the afflicted that they were not entirely alone. Despite the threat of frostbite, life pressed on. Work could not stop. Food still had to be earned, and children still had to be cared for. Yet each success in protecting the body, each small victory against the ice and cold became a testament to resilience. In a winter that seemed determined to strip the city of its vitality, every warm hand, every saved finger, and every care-filled gesture was a triumph. A quiet rebellion against the merciless frost that gripped London in 1895. The rivers, usually alive with the rhythm of boats and barges, became a silent expanse of ice during the harsh winter of 1895. A thin layer first appeared, frosting the surface in the early days of December, but as the cold deepened, larger sections solidified, turning the river into a pale gleaming path that seemed almost otherworldly in the gray light of dawn. For the poor, the frozen Thames was both a hazard and a resource. Ice-coated banks were treacherous, the surface slick with hidden cracks. Children dared one another to step carefully across patches, their laughter echoing faintly, while mothers watched from the edges, fear etched on every face. A single misstep could mean falling into icy water, and for those already weakened by hunger and illness, the consequences could be fatal. Yet the river offered small opportunities. Men gathered driftwood in broken crates along the banks, slipping carefully on ice to retrieve precious fuel. Some dared to fish through small cracks in the frozen surface, hoping to catch a meal for their family. The fog often hung low over the river, lending a ghostly aura to the scene, and the occasional figure, hooded, scarfed, and hunched, trudged along, hauling wood or water, their breath visible as soft clouds against the pale expanse. Despite the danger, there was an eerie beauty to the frozen Thames. Sunlight, when it pierced the gray skies, sparkled on the ice like scattered diamonds. The muffled sounds of the city were carried across its surface, softened and distant, giving the river a strange sense of serenity. Swans and ducks, unusual in the icy expanse, were sometimes spotted paddling through narrow openings in the frozen water. A delicate reminder of life persisting even in the harshest conditions. Evening brought a hush over the river. Frost glistened like powdered silver, and the cold was absolute, seeping into bones and clothing alike. Yet the frozen Thames also reminded Londoners of continuity, the flow of water beneath the ice, the resilience of nature, and the endurance of the city itself. For those navigating its banks, it was both a challenge and a symbol that life, even under the strictest frost, could endure, adapt, and quietly persist. Amid the relentless chill of London's streets, soup kitchens became sanctuaries of warmth and sustenance. Run by churches, charities, and volunteers, these kitchens offered more than food. They offered a moment of respite, a temporary shelter from the cold that gnawed at bones and spirits alike. Lines began forming before dawn. Men in threadbare coats, women clutching children, and the elderly with bent backs and weary eyes waited patiently, shifting from foot to keep from freezing. The air was thick with the smell of boiling broth mingled with smoke from nearby fires and the faint tang of damp clothing. Each person hoped for a generous ladle, a warm cup of liquid that could thaw frozen hands and provide the first real nourishment of the day. Inside the kitchens were crowded and lively. Volunteers ladled steaming soup from great cauldrons, careful not to spill, offering bread to those who had none. Children pressed close to the warmth, their cheeks glowing, while mothers cradled infants, grateful for the temporary comfort. Conversation was low but steady. Advice on where to find coal, news of charity distributions, or a shared story of endurance and survival. The soup itself was simple but sustaining. Thin broth enriched with vegetables, occasionally meat, and flavored with herbs and scraps made it both practical and comforting. Every mouthful was savored, bringing warmth not only to the body, but to the heart. For many, the soup kitchen was the only reliable meal of the day. A critical lifeline that could mean the difference between surviving another frostbitten night or succumbing to weakness. Beyond nourishment, the kitchens provided hope. The act of waiting, receiving, and sharing in the warmth reminded families that they were not forgotten. The kindness of strangers, the care taken to ensure no one left empty-handed, and the communal spirit of these spaces fostered resilience. In a city gripped by frost, hunger, and illness, soup kitchens were more than practical. They were symbols that even in the bleakest winters, compassion and humanity endured. The alleyways of London during the winter of 1895 were labyrinths of frost and shadow. Narrow and winding, they trapped the cold, creating a stillness that made every sound footsteps, a cough, or a whispered word echo sharply against the brick walls. Snow and ice coated the uneven cobblestones, turning each step into a careful negotiation between balance and speed. For those who lived and worked nearby, the alleys were both passageways and hazards. Children darted through them on errands, small hands clutching parcels or coins, their breath rising in misty clouds. Adults navigated with heavy bird and skullbread, or firewood cursing under their breath when the ice caused slips or falls. Every movement required attention, for a misstep could mean injury, and even the simplest bruise became dangerous in the bitter cold. The smell of the alleyways was distinct, a mixture of damp brick, refuse, and smoke from nearby chimneys. Water from melted snow pooled in corners, freezing overnight into slick surfaces. Stray animals padded silently through the slush, scavenging scraps left behind, while rats moved unseen, their presence a constant, silent reminder of the hardships of poverty. Despite the harshness, life persisted. Neighbors shared small gestures of care. a wrapped loaf passed over a gate, a warm scarf lent to a child, or a brief conversation that carried both advice and comfort. Even in the most confined, shadowed alleys, human resilience was evident, a quiet determination to survive, to help, and to endure the cruel winter. When night fell, the alleyways grew darker and colder. Lanterns, where available, cast dim circles of light that barely touched the frozen surfaces. The city seemed to hold its breath, the hush broken only by distant bells or the scraping of a cart over ice. And yet, even in these shadowed corridors, life moved on, steady, careful, and quietly brave as the people of London navigated the frozen maze of their winter-bound city. Hunger was a constant companion for London's poor during the winter of 1895, gnawing at stomachs and sapping strength even as the frost cut through clothing and walls. For many, each day was a struggle to secure even the smallest portion of nourishment, a loaf of bread, a turnip, or a thin slice of cheese that might ease the gnawing emptiness. Mothers often went without, giving the little they had to their children first. Tiny hands were pressed to hungry mouths, eyes wide with worry, as they measured portions carefully to stretch every morsel as far as possible. Fathers, too, sometimes went days with nothing more than a scrap, believing that survival meant sacrificing themselves for the youngest in the family. Even the elderly, already frail, endured hunger quietly, conserving whatever strength they had left. The streets themselves seemed to echo the struggle. Market scraps, discarded bread, or even fallen vegetables became precious finds. Children ran errands, collecting coins, or trading favors for small pieces of food. The quiet barter of neighborhoods, exchanging a handful of coal for a slice of bread or a bundle of firewood for a bit of soup, was both practical and necessary, a survival network built on shared scarcity. Yet, even amid this deprivation, there were moments of ingenuity and hope. Families would stretch a pot of broth with water, boil roots or leaves to supplement meals, or share what little they had with neighbors. Hunger sharpened the senses, teaching resourcefulness, patience, and the subtle art of surviving on the bare minimum. Night brought both relief and dread. A simple meal eaten beside a struggling fire warmed the body temporarily, yet the knowledge that tomorrow might bring emptiness loomed heavily, and still the people of London endured. The weight of hunger was heavy, but it was carried with determination, with tenderness, and with a quiet hope that the morning might offer small reprieves, new opportunities, and the chance to survive another day in the harsh winter of 1895. Even within the confines of tenement walls, the winter of 1895 made itself felt with a bitter persistence. Gaps in doors and windows allowed gusts of frigid air to snake through rooms, lifting threadbare curtains and causing the few belongings of a family to shiver in place. The wind was a constant presence, whistling and groaning through the bricks, rattling shutters, and chilling skin exposed even for the briefest moments. Families adapted as best they could. Blankets were layered over mattresses and stretched across windows to block drafts. Clothes were worn in multiples, each layer pressed tightly against the body. Yet even this was sometimes not enough to keep the chill from sinking into joints and bones. Mothers and children huddled close together, sharing warmth in quiet solidarity, while men returned from the streets, stiff and aching, their breath visible as they entered the cold rooms. The sound of the wind itself became part of daily life. It groaned like distant spirits moving through the alleys, rattled loose shutters, and carried the faint scent of smoke and soot from nearby chimneys. At night, it could seem almost alive, whispering through cracks and under doors, reminding residents that the city's cold was unyielding and that survival required both vigilance and endurance. Yet, even in the wind's sharp bite, there were moments of comfort. The hearth, small and flickering, offered pockets of heat where hands and faces could thaw. Candles provided a golden glow that softened the darkness, making the room feel safer against the relentless draft. Soft voices, murmured prayers, and gentle songs became shields against the harsh sound of the storm outside, wrapping the family in a cocoon of human warmth amid the cold. The chilling wind through the tenements was a reminder of the city's fragility in winter, but it also showcased the quiet courage of those living within its reach. Layer by layer, blanket by blanket, human perseverance combated the icy grip, proving that even in the harshest conditions, warmth could be found in the shared strength and tenderness of home. As evening settled over London, the tenements were bathed in the flickering glow of candlelight. The dim illumination cast dancing shadows across walls, stained with soot and age, transforming the small, cramped rooms into spaces both intimate and mysterious. Every movement became exaggerated in the glow, hands reaching for a blanket, a child's hair lifted by a draft, the curve of a mother's shoulder as she tended a sibling. Candles were precious. A single taper might light a room for only a few hours, and families conserved them carefully, blowing them out at the first hint of exhaustion. In some homes, a piece of tallow or a small oil lamp supplemented the light, but the effect was always fragile. The flame's gentle tremor reminded everyone of the tenuousness of their comfort, yet also offered a comforting rhythm, a heartbeat against the silence of winter nights. The shadows themselves told stories. Children watched as shapes shifted across walls, inventing fantastical tales, a dragon curling near the ceiling, a knight moving stealthily across a distant hill, or a tiny village bustling in miniature. Mothers whispered softly, narrating these visions with care, letting imagination provide warmth and distraction from the harshness outside. Even the adults, weary and cold, allowed their minds to wander into these fleeting realms, finding small reprieves from fatigue and worry. The flickering light also highlighted human resilience. Fingers chapped and red were pressed together near the flame. Old knees, stiff from years of labor, found relief in the warmth radiating from a hearth. Conversations were hushed, measured, and gentle, carrying advice, stories, and quiet encouragement from one family member to another. Even in scarcity, there was a sense of continuity, a shared ritual that gave structure and comfort to life in the frozen city. In the candlelight shadows, the people of London found both enchantment and solace. The darkness outside was vast and unyielding, but the small circles of light, the stories whispered, and the gentle heat from a tiny flame offered sanctuary. For a few precious hours, winter's cruelty was softened, replaced by warmth, imagination, and the enduring courage of the human heart. Even within the walls of homes, the cold winter brought an unrelenting dampness that seemed impossible to escape. Moisture seeped through the cracked brick, rising from frozen streets below, and settled on the floorboards, walls, and ceilings. It made the rooms chillier than the air outside, and the dampness clung to clothes, blankets, and skin, deepening the sense of cold that never fully left the body. Families learned to adapt, though it was never enough. Wet clothes were wrung out and layered, blankets shaken and aired whenever the wind allowed, and fires kept alight as long as possible. The smell of damp wood and faint mold mingled with the aroma of meager meals, creating an atmosphere heavy with the reality of survival. Children's hair frizzed from the moisture, and even their laughter seemed muted by the pervasive chill. The damp exacerbated illness. Coughs and sniffles became more frequent, bodies weakened, and fevers lingered longer. Mothers pressed hot cloths to their children's faces, rubbed their hands and feet vigorously, and whispered encouragements as they tried to counter the insidious cold that seeped into every joint and bone. The elderly, already frail, shivered and hunched, their joints stiff and painful, seeking any patch of warmth they could find. Yet amid the damp there were small victories. Clothes dried near the fire, a loaf of bread baked to provide both nutrition and warmth, and a shared blanket offered reprieve from the clammy air. Families pressed together, not just for heat, but for comfort, whispering stories and prayers, creating microcosms of warmth that, however fleeting, staved off the bleakness. The dampness was a persistent enemy, invisible yet undeniable, wrapping itself around bodies and belongings alike. But the people of London endured it with quiet resilience, finding ways to survive and even find comfort amid the moisture that defined their winter existence. Each day, each night became a lesson in patience, resourcefulness, and the stubborn persistence of the human spirit against the coldest and wettest of adversaries. As night deepened, a profound stillness settled over London's poorest quarters. The clamor of the Datha, cartwheels scraping frozen cobblestones, the calls of street vendors, the laughter of children playing in the snow faded into silence, leaving only the whisper of the wind through narrow alleys and cracks in tenement walls. It was in these quiet hours that the city's residents experienced both the stark cruelty and the fragile comfort of winter. Families huddled together beneath layered blankets and quilts, sharing body warmth to stave off the relentless cold. The soft glow of candlelight or a flickering hearth became a gentle sentinel, casting long, moving shadows across walls and furniture. Even the slightest movement to shifting child, a creak of floorboards, the gentle breath of a sleeping parent felt amplified, a delicate reminder that life persisted despite the biting frost outside. The nights were often filled with vigilance. Parents listened carefully for coughing or shivering, aware that the slightest sign of illness or hypothermia could become dangerous. They checked the hearth's fire, ensuring that it burned steadily, coaxing the coals with careful breaths, and adding tiny pieces of coal or wood to maintain warmth without wasting precious fuel. The act was methodical, almost ritualistic, a nightly demonstration of care and endurance. Outside, the fog and frost wrapped the streets in a hushed, silvered silence. The frozen Thames gleamed faintly in the distance, and gas lamps diffused by the mist offered weak circles of light that barely reached the icy cobbles below. Occasionally the sound of a distant bell or the far-off scrape of a cart echoed faintly, but mostly the city seemed suspended in a frozen stillness. Even in hardship, these quiet nights were moments of reflection and connection. Families whispered prayers, shared memories of better times, or softly sang lullabies to soothe children into sleep. In the stillness, the heartbeats of those enduring the frost could be heard. The gentle rhythm of human persistence, a quiet testament to the resilience that winter could not extinguish. Through the long nights of winter, the windows of London's tenements became delicate canvases of frost. Ice crystals formed intricate patterns across glass panes, curling and feathery designs that seemed almost magical, yet reminded every household of the chill pressing in from outside. The cold seeped through even the smallest cracks, leaving windows misted and the air just inside the panes painfully frigid. Families pressed close to the warmth within, sometimes tracing the frosted patterns with fingertips, marveling at the fleeting beauty despite the discomfort. Children, curious and imaginative, created stories from the shapes: dragons coiled across a pane, snowflakes dancing like fairies, or entire frozen forests appearing in miniature. The simple act of observing the frost brought wonder into otherwise harsh gray days and nights. The frosted windows also carried practical challenges. The condensation and ice made it difficult to see outside, obscuring streets and passersby, enforcing careful navigation indoors. Mothers wiped the panes to peek out at approaching neighbors or to check whether children had returned safely from brief excursions. Every opening of the window for air meant a rush of cold. Every touch of the icy glass sent shivers through numb fingers. Despite the hardships, the frosted windows offered a rare aesthetic reprieve. The morning sun, when it peeked through, made the ice shimmer like thousands of tiny diamonds, casting faint glimmers into rooms otherwise dimmed by soot and the gray winter sky. In those moments, the harshness of winter softened, and even the poorest residents could glimpse beauty in the frozen details of their world. At night, the frost sparkled against candlelight, lending the rooms a magical, almost ethereal glow. And as families huddled beneath blankets, the frozen windows became a silent companion, a testament to both the merciless cold and the small, quiet wonders that could still be found within the bleak winter of 1895. Above every tenement and row of houses, chimneys stood as silent sentinels against the harsh winter sky. In 1895, they were both lifelines and sources of constant labor, their soot-streaked faces bearing witness to the struggle for warmth that defined London's freezing months. Smoke curled upward from countless hearths, twisting into the gray sky, a signal of survival and determination against the relentless cold. Families relied heavily on these chimneys, for the fire within provided heat, nourishment, and the faint comfort of light. Men shoveled coal into small stoves and fireplaces, while women fanned embers, coaxing the flames to life. Yet the act of burning fuel was never simple. Too much, and the room became smoky and oppressive. Too little, and warmth was fleeting, leaving bodies stiff and shivering. Each household learned the delicate balance by trial and endurance. Outside, the soot that drifted from chimneys coated streets, clothes, and faces. Children played amidst the haze, their hair dusted in black flecks, and adults wiped windows and furniture in a constant struggle to keep interiors habitable. The thick smoke mingled with fog, sometimes creating a dense gray soup that clung to the city, reducing visibility and adding an acrid bite to the already chill air. Yet, despite the constant labor and the mess of soot, chimneys represented hope. The rising smoke was a quiet declaration that life continued, that warmth persisted inside, and that families were not defeated by the frost. Every flicker of fire, every curling wisp of smoke, became a symbol of resilience, a visual heartbeat of endurance amidst a city frozen and shadowed by winter's cruelty. At night, when all fires glowed softly within, the soot-streaked chimneys stood silhouetted against the pale moonlight. Stoic and enduring, they were reminders that survival required effort, care, and vigilance, but that with these, life could persist even in the harshest winters of Victorian London. In every corner of London during the winter of 1895, the sharp, acrid scent of coal hung in the air. It was the lifeblood of warmth for the poor, burned in hearths, stoves, and ovens. Yet, it carried a heaviness that reminded families of both survival and struggle. The smell clung to clothes, hair, and furniture, a constant presence that marked the rhythm of daily life in frostbound tenements. Coal was precious. Men spent long hours hauling heavy sacks from street deliveries, their hands blistered, faces streaked with soot, and backs aching from the effort. Every lump was weighed and measured carefully. A single misstep in saving it could mean hours of shivering. Women and children learned to stretch each ember, layering kindling, fanning coals, and protecting the fire from drafts, so that warmth lasted through the coldest hours of the night. The scent itself was a paradox, both comforting and oppressive. Inhale deeply near a glowing hearth, and the sharp coal aroma promised heat and sustenance. Step outside into foggy streets, and the coal-laden smoke mixed with soot and ice, becoming pungent and biting, a reminder of the harshness beyond the four walls. Even clothing and bedding absorbed it, the smell lingering long after a fire had burned low. Despite the weight and smell, coal was a symbol of resilience. Each small fire fueled hope, kept families together, and created a safe space amid the frozen city. The aroma, however pungent, carried reassurance. Warmth existed, food could be cooked, and life, however difficult, continued. Families learned to appreciate the subtle comfort in the smoke, associating it with survival, protection, and the shared determination to endure another long, frigid night. As evening fell and fires burned low, the lingering smell of coal served as a silent lullaby, a reminder that even amid frost, scarcity, and struggle, warmth could be coaxed from patience, care, and persistence. Winter of 1895 brought more than frost and hunger. It carried illness that preyed relentlessly on London's poor. Cold, damp air, and cramped living conditions allowed fevers, coughs, and chills to spread quickly, leaving families huddled in quiet vigil over sick children, aging parents, or weakened neighbors. The sick were often confined to small corners of rooms, swaddled in layers of blankets, their breaths shallow and hands clammy with fever. Mothers whispered tirelessly, stroking foreheads, pressing warm flannels against cheeks, and murmuring prayers as the chill attempted to creep into every joint. Fathers brought small cups of wheat broth or tea, carefully coaxing the afflicted to drink, knowing that nourishment and warmth might mean the difference between life and death. Every movement was slow and deliberate, mindful of fragile bodies that could not withstand abrupt motion or exposure to even the faintest drafts. The atmosphere of the room was heavy with both worry and tenderness. Steam rose from small stoves and cups of tea, mingling with the faint scent of medicinal herbs or soot. Voices were hushed, interrupted only by coughing or the occasional sigh, each sound amplified in the stillness of frozen nights. The quiet vigilance of caretakers was a delicate, ongoing labor, a blend of compassion and resilience. Neighbors sometimes contributed what little they could, extra blankets, a small bundle of coal, or the tiniest ration of food. In these small acts, the community found strength, forming a fragile network that supported the vulnerable, even when resources were scarce. Every flicker of improvement, every slight smile, or whispered thanks from the sick, became a beacon of hope in a world otherwise dominated by frost and hardship. As night deepened, the caretakers remained alert, shifting beside fires, adjusting blankets, whispering softly in the dark. Even when sleep came briefly, it was punctuated by worry, a silent testament to the endurance, tenderness, and courage demanded by a winter that seemed intent on testing every soul in London's poorest quarters. In the midst of London's frozen streets, the tolling of distant church bells offered both a rhythm and a reminder of the life continuing beyond frostbound alleys. The clear, solemn chimes traveled across narrow lanes and open squares, carrying over the frozen Thames, cutting through fog and ice with a resonance that was at once comforting and haunting. For the poor, the bells marked the passage of time, measuring days in a city where daylight hours were brief and work was grueling. Children recognized the hours by the ringing, knowing when to pause, play, or when a parent would return from early deliveries of coal or water. Adults listened with quiet reverence, some pausing mid-task to let the sound fill their lungs and hearts, drawing a small intangible comfort from the continuity it represented. The sound also carried a spiritual weight. Churches were not only sites of charity, but of solace, offering prayers for health, survival, and hope. Even those who could not afford a seat inside the building felt the resonance as a communal presence, a reminder that they were part of a larger city, a network of human care that endured despite frost and scarcity. On particularly still nights, the bells seemed to echo endlessly, bouncing off brick walls and frozen rooftops, blending with the subtle hum of the city. The wind carried the sound into tenements past shuttered windows and frosted panes, reaching families who had long since retreated beneath blankets. Children listened from their cots, eyes heavy with sleep, as the tolls seemed to count their endurance, offering a gentle rhythm that aligned with their own slow, measured breathing. Even in hardship, the distant bells brought reassurance. They marked time, resilience, and continuity, a melodic reminder that life persisted, that survival had meaning, and that in the frozen heart of London, small comforts could still be found amid frost, hunger, and shadow. Winter in 1895 wrapped London in a thick gray fog that seemed almost alive, pressing against buildings, streets, and people alike. The damp mist clung to coats and hair, seeped into lungs, and muffled sound, turning familiar streets into blurred corridors where shadows and shapes became indistinct. The fog carried a damp cold that chilled the skin and made each breath heavy, a constant reminder that the city was under winter's unyielding grip. For the poor, the fog complicated daily life. Navigating icy streets became more perilous when visibility was low. Children returning from errands clutched hands and baskets tightly, while adults paused frequently to ensure they remained on safe paths. The cold moisture settled in clothing, blankets, and bedding, making every layer damp and uncomfortable, and leaving shivers that lingered even when near a fire. The fog also carried an eerie beauty. Gas lamps glowed like faint halos, their light diffused into soft circles that flickered with the movement of passersby. Trees and rooftops were softened, edges obscured, and the world seemed slowed as though suspended in a quiet gray dream. For a moment, even the harshest realities, the hunger, the frost, the constant struggle, felt softened by the gentle diffusion of light and shadow. Yet beneath the beauty, the fog heightened isolation. Sounds were muted, streets felt emptier, and the distance between homes and neighbors seemed amplified. It became a city of introspection, where small gestures, a shared blanket, a passing smile, or a whispered word carried amplified significance, bridging the invisible gaps the fog created. Even in the smothering gray, life persisted. Families huddled close to fires. Children slept safely in layered blankets. And those who ventured into the streets adapted, stepping carefully over ice and puddles. The fog, oppressive though it was, became part of the rhythm of survival, teaching caution, patience, and the quiet endurance needed to persist through one of London's harshest winters. Even amid hardship, London's children found ways to play, their resilience shining through the frost and gloom of winter 1895. In small courtyards, alleyways, and patches of frozen ground, they created games from what little they had, using snow, ice, and scraps of wood to invent moments of joy in an otherwise relentless season. Snowballs flew cautiously at first as icy hands struggled to form them, but soon laughter rang out, echoing between narrow tenements. Children slid along slick cobblestones, pretending the ice was a racetrack, their cheeks pink from both cold and excitement. Small wooden carts or tin pails became sleds, carrying siblings down gentle slopes or across frozen patches, while older children constructed miniature forts from discarded crates and frozen debris. Parents watched from windows or doorways, sometimes offering a word of caution, sometimes allowing the brief freedom, knowing that these small joys bolstered spirits and offered fleeting warmth against the cold. Mothers tucked mittens tightly over hands and ears, while fathers sometimes helped adjust makeshift sleds or cleared ice from alleyways to prevent injuries. Every chuckle and shout was a small rebellion against the oppressive chill. Even in play, the children learned resilience. They understood which surfaces were safe, how to conserve energy, and how to navigate the frozen streets with care. They also learned cooperation, sharing scraps of snow or taking turns on the tiny sleds, forging bonds that would endure beyond the harsh winter. As the sun set and twilight deepened, their game slowed, and they trudged home with frostbitten fingers and rosy cheeks. Yet even as they entered dimly lit rooms, their laughter lingered, a faint warmth in the cold tenements. These winter games, brief and simple though they were, became memories that offered comfort, connection, and a reminder that joy could persist even in the bleakest of seasons. While most of London's residents slept beneath layers of blankets, the streets at midnight held a quiet, haunting presence. Snow and ice glistened under the dim glow of gas lamps, fog curling in low waves along the cobblestones. The city seemed suspended, as though holding its breath against the harsh winter that had gripped it for months. Those who traversed the streets at this hour were few, but necessity drove them onward. Cold deliveries continued late into the night, carried by men whose muscles ached from the day's labor. Mothers sought food or medicine from late charity kitchens, their children clinging to their skirts, shivering in the frosty silence. Even the occasional doctor moved swiftly, stepping carefully over icy patches as he carried his kit to those in need. Sounds were magnified in the stillness. Footsteps echoed, the scrape of boots against ice rang sharply, and distant church bells told faintly, a measured rhythm amid the hush. Every door that opened, every cough and every whisper seemed amplified, giving the city an eerie intimacy that was both beautiful and unsettling. The cold at this hour penetrated deeply, seeping past layers of clothing, numbing hands and cheeks, and leaving even the warmest hearts longing for the hearth. Yet the midnight streets also revealed unexpected beauty, moonlight reflecting off frozen puddles, the glitter of frost along rooftops, and the soft silver sheen on the ice-covered Thames. It was a reminder that even in hardship, London carried moments of quiet majesty, waiting to be seen by those brave enough to venture into the night. For the people who walked these streets, the journey was both struggle and reflection. Each step was a testament to endurance, a silent affirmation that life persisted even when the world seemed cold, still, and merciless. And as they returned home to huddled families and the warmth of flickering fires, they carried with them the quiet knowledge that the city, like them, had survived another frozen night. While most of London's residents slept beneath thick layers of blankets, the streets at midnight were a world of quiet intensity. A city transformed by frost and fog into a place both haunting and strangely beautiful. Snow and ice glazed the cobblestones, catching the dim glow of gas lamps and creating a shimmer that seemed almost magical. The fog hung low, curling and twisting around buildings, softening their edges and muffling the usual sounds of traffic and labor, giving the streets a surreal, dreamlike quality. Only a few ventured out at this late hour, driven by necessity. Coal deliveries continued tirelessly, the weight of heavy sacks pressing down on hunched shoulders, faces streaked with soot and fatigue. Men moved cautiously, boots scraping against ice-laden stones, every step deliberate to avoid falls that could prove disastrous in the cold. Mothers and older children navigated the streets in search of food, medicine, or charity, eyes alert for danger, breath-forming clouds in the frosty air. Even doctors, their hands rough and chilled from long hours of walking, made nightly rounds, carrying small leather kits to the sickest and most vulnerable. The sounds of midnight were amplified in the eerie stillness. Each footfall echoed sharply against the buildings, the scraping of carts or boots on ice, ringing with startling clarity. A distant church bell tolled slowly, each reverberation seeming to reach every alleyway, marking time and offering a faint sense of continuity. A cough or the creak of a shuttered window became a vivid reminder that life was continuing quietly in the midst of hardship. The cold was relentless. It penetrated even the thickest layers of clothing, biting into fingers and toes and leaving exposed faces red and raw. Every breath felt like frost on the lungs, sharp and bracing, and the fog carried moisture that seeped into damp coats and woolen scarves. Hands were stuffed deep into pockets or pressed against bodies for warmth, and heads were tucked into scarves or hoods to shield fragile ears and cheeks. Despite the hardship, the midnight streets demanded vigilance. For missteps on icy patches could lead to serious injury, or worse, leaving a traveler stranded in the bitter night. Yet, even amid the severity, there was a haunting beauty. Moonlight glinted off frozen puddles, turning streets into silvered rivers. Frost sparkled like tiny crystals along window ledges and rooftops, catching the faint glow of gas lamps. The ice-covered Thames stretched silently across the city. Glimmering under fog and moonlight, a pale ribbon of glassy reflection that seemed almost unreal. Shadows of lone figures, distorted by flickering lamps and mist, played along the walls, creating ephemeral patterns that vanished as quickly as they appeared, leaving the streets feeling alive with quiet mystery. For those who braved the midnight streets, each journey was an act of endurance and reflection. It was a time for careful steps, quiet observation, and small, precious moments of wonder. Every coal sack delivered. Every errand completed. Every child returned safely to bed was a triumph against both nature and circumstance. Returning home, the travelers were greeted by flickering hearths, layered blankets, and the warmth of family, their footsteps softened by the snow. They carried with them not only the physical relief of safety, but also the quiet knowledge that London, frozen, and still, though it might appear, pulsed with life and resilience through every dark, frost-bitten night. Inside the tenements, the hearth became the center of life. A small oasis of warmth against the unforgiving winter of 1895. Its steady glow illuminated soot-streaked walls and the faces of weary families, casting long, flickering shadows that danced across the cramped rooms. The fire's gentle crackle and pop created a subtle, almost hypnotic rhythm, a soft hum that contrasted with the harsh wind and frost pressing against windows and doors. Families gathered close, pressing their hands near the flames, allowing the warmth to seep into stiff fingers and aching joints. Mothers shifted blankets, tucked children nearer, and coaxed small embers into larger flames with careful breaths. Fathers rearranged coal or firewood, ensuring that the glow lasted through the coldest hours of the night. Every ember was precious, every spark a small triumph in a city gripped by frost. The hearth's warmth did more than chase away the cold. It became a sanctuary for conversation, storytelling, and reflection. Children listened quietly to tales of resilience, morality, and gentle humor, their eyes wide and their cheeks flushed with heat. Adults shared quiet confessions, whispered advice, or tender reassurances to one another. The fire created a private world, insulating families from the misery of frostbitten streets, frozen alleyways, and damp tenements. The scent of smoke and coal mingled with the aroma of simple meals, thin soups, boiled potatoes, or small scraps of meat, transforming each room into a haven of senses. Even the flicker of light seemed to have a calming effect, smoothing tense expressions, relaxing stiff muscles, and soothing frayed nerves. In the glow of the hearth, the harshness of frost, hunger, and illness felt momentarily softened, replaced by the gentle rhythm of survival and care. Night after night, the hearth provided this quiet comfort. It symbolized both struggle and triumph, an anchor in the relentless winter. Families huddled close, drawing warmth and reassurance, not only from the fire, but from one another. In those moments, the frozen city outside seemed distant, irrelevant, and temporary. Within the hearth's embrace, life endured, softened, and held the promise of yet another day of perseverance. Even in the harsh winter of 1895, amid frost, hunger, and illness, the quietest moments of kindness illuminated the lives of London's poor. In streets dusted with snow and lined with frozen puddles, neighbors offered small gestures that meant more than warmth or food. They carried hope, connection, and the fragile reassurance that no one was entirely alone. A woman might share a scrap of bread with a child begging at a street corner or slip an extra blanket through a tenement window for a family too cold to sleep. Men carrying coals sometimes gave a few lumps to those who could not afford them, and children offered their gloves or mittens to a friend whose hands were red and raw. Each act, though tiny, created ripples of comfort that spread through the community like whispered prayers. These small deeds were especially vital during illness. A neighbor's soft voice offering encouragement, a shared cup of tea delivered to a sick room, or a blanket tucked over shivering shoulders, often made the difference between despair and endurance. The poorest residents, though struggling themselves, often found ways to provide what they could, proof that generosity and compassion need not wait for wealth or abundance. The fog, frost, and damp made these acts both challenging and more profound. Carrying coal through icy alleys, braving snow to deliver food, or lending clothing to someone in need was physically taxing. Yet, every effort reinforced bonds and offered warmth that no fire could entirely replicate. Families felt the comfort not only of the tangible aid but also of the knowledge that they were remembered, valued, and supported. As night deepened, these gestures left lingering warmth in homes and hearts. The people of London relied not only on fires, blankets, and soup, but on the quiet generosity of those around them. In a winter that seemed designed to test every soul, these small acts of kindness became a lifeline, softening the cruelty of frost, illuminating the darkness, and reminding everyone that even in the harshest conditions, humanity endured. Even in the coldest months of 1895, London's winter markets remained hubs of life, activity, and survival. Despite frost coating the streets and icy fog drifting between stalls, vendors set up their wares with determination, shouting softly over the muffled hum of the city to attract the attention of passers. The markets offered essential goods: coal, vegetables, bread, and small scraps of meat that sustained families through the bitter cold. The air was filled with a mixture of aromas: the sharp temps of fresh vegetables, the yeasty warmth of bread, the faint smoke of nearby fires, and the occasional scent of roasting chestnuts sold as a small treat. Every sense was engaged. Hands brushed against cold, damp sacks, eyes scanned the frost-laden tables for affordable goods, and ears listened for bargains amidst the quiet chatter. Children clung to their parents, shivering but wide-eyed, absorbing the bustle of survival with curiosity and awe. Haggling was both necessity and art. Every penny counted, and families bartered tirelessly, stretching limited resources to feed their households. Vendors often showed small generosity, perhaps slipping an extra turnip or a handful of coal into a purchase. Knowing the hardship of the season, these exchanges fostered a delicate balance of compassion, pragmatism, and resilience that kept both buyers and sellers moving through the winter months. The markets also offered fleeting comfort and social connection. Neighbors met to exchange news, offer advice on keeping warm, or share a brief laugh amid the frost. Even the smallest interactions, a shared nod, a whispered encouragement, or the passing of a scrap of bread reminded residents that community could thrive even in the harshest conditions. As the sun dipped behind gray clouds, casting long shadows over icy stalls, families left the markets carrying their meager purchases, grateful for the sustenance and small moments of connection they had gathered. The winter markets, though demanding and frigid, were a vital lifeline, a rhythm of survival and a reminder that even in frostbound London, life moved steadily forward. As darkness settled over London, another layer of the city's life emerged: the silent, careful patrols of the night watch. These men moved deliberately through frozen streets, their boots crunching softly on icy cobblestones, carrying lanterns that cast dim circles of light across frost-covered walls and alleys. Their presence was both protective and reassuring, a quiet guarantee that even in the dead of night, some vigilance remained. The night watchmen were familiar figures to many of the poor. Children peered from shuttered windows, and parents nodded respectfully as these men passed, their lanterns revealing faces drawn with fatigue yet resolute. Every footfall echoed in narrow alleys, mingling with the distant sounds of the frozen Thames, faint church bells, or the rustle of soot-streaked chimneys. The rhythm of their patrols brought a subtle structure to the night, a heartbeat that reminded residents that life continued even when the streets seemed deserted. Their duties were not easy. Icy patches and snow made movement treacherous. Fog and frost limited visibility, and the bitter cold gnawed at fingers and toes. They watched for fires that had gone out, checked on the vulnerable, and ensured that mischief or misfortune did not find easy purchase in the quiet hours. Every measured step was both a protective act and a testament to endurance, as the men combed through the city with eyes sharp for trouble, yet mindful of the fragility of the people they served. For those inside tenements, the night watch represented safety and reassurance. The faint glow of a lantern in the distance, the muffled echo of boots, or the soft whistle of a patrolman carried through alleys like a lullaby, blending with the hum of hearths, the murmur of prayers, and the slow, steady breathing of sleeping families. It was a subtle, comforting rhythm that promised continuity, vigilance, and the quiet courage of those who worked to keep the city's frostbitten residents secure in the frozen city amidst ice, fog, and hardship. The silent footfalls of the night watch offered an unspoken reassurance, even when darkness seemed endless. Life endured, care persisted, and every soul in London could find some measure of comfort in knowing they were not alone. In the freezing months of 1895, firewood was as precious as gold to London's poor. Streets lined with tenements bore witness to families hauling bundles through ice-slicked alleys, each log a fragile promise of warmth and survival. The struggle began long before nightfall as parents and older children ventured into fogged streets, shivering in layers of patched clothing, seeking wood from street vendors, charity stacks, or abandoned scraps. The weight of the bundles pressed heavily against tired bodies, muscles aching with each careful step across frost-hardened cobblestones. The smallest miscalculation, a slip, a dropped log, A torn bundle meant hours of lost effort and exposure to the biting cold. Despite exhaustion, determination prevailed. The firewood represented not merely comfort, but survival itself. A warm hearth meant children could sleep without shivering, porridge could be heated, and the bleakness of the day could be momentarily softened. Inside the tenement, every stick was carefully arranged. Families learned to coax reluctant flames from damp logs, fanning embers and adjusting placement to extract maximum warmth. The scent of burning wood mingled with coal and soot, creating a smoky cocoon that both protected against frost and filled the room with a peculiar sense of homely intimacy. Even small successes kindling that caught instantly, flames that crackled steadily became celebrations in miniature, moments of relief in a city otherwise defined by scarcity and struggle. Children watched closely, learning the delicate art of fire management. They helped feed embers, guarded against drafts that threatened to extinguish warmth, and clutched blankets tightly over shivering shoulders. Through these tasks, lessons of patience, caution, and cooperation were passed down, linking generations in a shared knowledge born from necessity and endurance. Even as the frost pressed against windows and seeped into walls, the firewood stood as a beacon of perseverance. Each flame, each flicker of heat was a victory against the relentless winter, a quiet triumph of human resourcefulness, resilience, and the unyielding desire to protect and sustain those one loved in the harshest conditions London had yet seen. For London's poorest, during the winter of 1895, soup kitchens became vital havens of warmth, nourishment, and human connection. As frost gripped streets and tenements offered little protection, the humble kitchens opened their doors to those who could not afford even a slice of bread. The thick, steaming aroma of broth and vegetables spilled into alleyways, a fragrant beacon drawing shivering families toward temporary relief. Inside, the kitchens were bustling yet calm, a delicate balance of efficiency and care. Volunteers ladled soup into worn bowls, careful to provide enough for each visitor. Flames crackled under large cauldrons, steam rising in gentle waves, warming both the air and those who lingered nearby. Families clustered together, sharing warmth and conversation as they waited, their cheeks red from cold, but hearts softened by the simple act of being fed. The soup itself was modest but sustaining, a mixture of root vegetables, thin meat scraps, barley, and a sprinkling of herbs. Each sip carried both nourishment and comfort, a small relief from the gnawing emptiness that hunger inflicted. Children, once quiet from fatigue, brightened with each bowl, their laughter mingling with the muted murmur of adult conversation. The kitchens offered more than food. They offered respite, reassurance, and a rare sense of security amid the uncertainty of frostbound life. Evenings at the soup kitchens were punctuated by quiet guidance and gentle interactions. Volunteers offered advice on staying warm, preserving fuel at home, and tending to the sick. Strangers exchanged small gestures of kindness, an extra piece of bread, a reassuring smile, a shared bench by the fire, reminding visitors that despite hardship, human compassion endured. As night fell and families departed, carrying their bowls or scraps home, the warmth lingered in their hearts. The soup kitchens were more than sustenance. They were symbols of resilience and solidarity, proving that even in the harshest winters, care, kindness, and hope could still be found. For many, a single bowl of soup meant a night of safer sleep, a momentary shield against frost, and the knowledge that survival was possible. Even in the unforgiving grip of 1895, the River Thames, frozen and silvery, stretched through the heart of London like a glassy ribbon, reflecting pale moonlight and fog in a way that made the city appear both ethereal and unyielding. Its usual bustle, the clatter of barges and chatter of dockworkers, had slowed, leaving an eerie quiet broken only by the occasional creak of ice and the muffled footsteps of those daring to walk along its banks. For the poor, the Thames was a source of both livelihood and danger. Men still ventured to the river early, fishing through small holes in thin ice, or cutting blocks of frozen water for homes that lacked sufficient coal. Each step was cautious, measured, for the ice could betray the unwary, and hypothermia lurked beneath even a shallow fall. Women and children watched from the edges of streets or bridges, their breath fogging in the cold air, hoping that those who worked along the river returned safely with sustenance or warmth. The frozen river also carried an unexpected, haunting beauty. Frost-etched, delicate patterns on wooden piers. Thin layers of ice shimmered like crystal under moonlight, and mist rising from the water created a ghostly veil that softened the city's harsh lines. Even soot-stained walls and tenements seemed to reflect a faint silver glow, lending a surreal quality to the frozen landscape. Children pressed their noses against frosted window panes to glimpse the river, imagining adventures across its glassy surface, while adults paused briefly in their routines to admire the rare, fleeting spectacle. Yet the Thames was a reminder of winter's severity. Frost and ice made transport difficult, silenced commerce, and deepened the chill that seeped into nearby homes. For those relying on the river for survival, it demanded respect, caution, and unceasing vigilance. Each crossing, each small harvest of frozen resources required both skill and luck. As night fell and the city grew still, the frosted Thames became a mirror for London itself, a mixture of danger and beauty, hardship and endurance. The frozen waters reflected the resilience of the people living along its banks, their careful steps, and quiet determination, carving out life in a city held fast by frost, fog, and winter's relentless hand. In the cramped, frost-chilled rooms of Victorian London, the simplest comforts carried extraordinary significance. Among them, the warmth of shared beds offered both physical relief and emotional security. Families often crowded together under thin mattresses and layered blankets, pressing close to conserve heat and protect one another from the relentless cold. The bodies of parents, children, and sometimes even neighbors intertwined in an improvised network of warmth and care. Blankets were layered meticulously, each fold and tuck a strategy against frost that crept through walls and windows. Children nestled between parents, arms wrapped tightly around smaller siblings, heads resting on makeshift pillows, absorbing both the heat and the steady heartbeat that provided reassurance. Mothers adjusted bodies and blankets throughout the night, ensuring that no one's fingers or toes were left exposed, whispering softly to soothe the restless or ill. Shared beds also became spaces of comfort beyond the warmth they provided. Quiet conversation, gentle laughter, and whispered stories flowed freely, easing tension and fear. Older children taught younger ones simple songs or rhymes, their soft voices blending with the murmur of fires crackling in distant hearths. Even amid illness or fatigue, the act of huddling together fostered a sense of connection, safety, and resilience that no firewood or coal alone could offer. The close quarters magnified senses, the faint scent of candle smoke, the warmth radiating from another body, the rhythmic rise and fall of breath. Every sigh, whisper, or shift was a reminder that life persisted, that survival was shared, and that each individual contributed to the fragile cocoon against winter's cruelty. As night deepened, the warmth of shared beds became a sanctuary. Frost pressed at windows and walls. Fog crept through streets, and the cold city outside loomed. But within these tightly knit spaces, families rested, rejuvenated, and sustained. In the quiet intimacy of human proximity, the harshness of winter softened, replaced by the enduring warmth of love, protection, and shared endurance. In the small soot-darkened rooms of Victorian London, candlelight was a precious companion through the long frozen nights of 1895. Flickering flames cast warm, trembling glows across cracked walls, stained wood, and worn fabrics, transforming cold, dim spaces into temporary havens of comfort. The gentle light danced in rhythm with shadows, creating movement and life in otherwise still frost-laden rooms. Families gathered close to the few candles they possessed, careful to shield the fragile flames from draft sneaking through cracks in windows and doors. Mothers held babies near the soft light, rocking them gently, while older children sat cross-legged on blankets, tracing the glow with curious fingers or listening to quiet stories and lessons. The tiny flames illuminated faces, revealing lines of worry softened by trust, and eyes that, despite fatigue, glimmered with hope. The scent of burning tallow or wax mingled with coal smoke, damp wool, and the faint aroma of evening meals. Each inhalation reminded families of survival, the fire that sustained them, the food that nourished, and the light that kept darkness at bay. In rooms too small to allow much distance, the glow connected everyone, highlighting hands reaching out for warmth, shared blankets, or whispered reassurances. Even the simplest tasks became rituals around the candlelight. Water was boiled with careful attention, porridge stirred slowly, and clothes hung near the warmth to dry just enough. Shadows danced across faces as hands moved, creating a quiet intimacy, a sense that within these flickering circles of light, the harshness of frost, fog, and hunger could be held at bay. Candlelight offered more than illumination. It offered rhythm, security, and solace. Each gentle flicker reminded the inhabitants that life endured, that small comforts mattered, and that even in the bleakest nights of winter, warmth and hope could persist in the glow of a fragile, trembling flame. During the harsh winter of 1895, charitable acts became lifelines for London's poorest residents. Churches, mission halls, and benevolent individuals opened their doors, offering not just food and warmth, but comfort and reassurance to those beleaguered by frost, hunger, and illness. The sound of doors creaking open, the quiet shuffle of feet across icy floors, and the murmur of voices created a rhythm of solace amid the harsh city nights. Inside, rooms were filled with the mingled scent of hot soup, burning coal, and damp clothing warmed near small stoves. Volunteers worked tirelessly, ladling nourishing broth, distributing thin bread, or tending to minor illnesses with care and attention. Families clustered together, huddling for both warmth and companionship, grateful for each meal, each blanket, each moment of respite. Even the smallest gestures, a kind word, an encouraging smile, offered a profound sense of hope and humanity. Children received extra attention. Cups of warm tea or small treats passed hand to hand. They listened to stories or lessons imparted gently by those who had dedicated their nights to charity. absorbing wisdom alongside the fleeting warmth that flickered through these temporary havens. Adults shared whispered thanks and quiet conversation, offering reassurance that they were not forgotten, that the world beyond frost and fog still held care and concern. Charity also became a social bond. Families who struggled alongside one another formed tenuous friendships, exchanging advice on keeping warm, rationing resources, and tending to the sick. Even in the cramped, dim spaces, the sense of community created a subtle heat, a warmth that could not be measured in coal or blankets, but that endured in shared experience. As night deepened, those leaving charity halls carried more than food. They carried renewed spirit, a reminder of endurance, and the knowledge that even in the cruelest winter, human kindness could pierce the cold and light the way toward survival. The winter charity was a small, steadfast beacon, showing that hope could exist even amidst frost, fog, and the relentless struggle of 1895 London. Even amid the freezing nights of 1895, moments of laughter occasionally pierced the heavy silence of London's frost-bound streets. It was rare and delicate, arising from children chasing one another over icy puddles, families sharing whispered jokes by dim candlelight, or neighbors exchanging stories while tending to fires or rations. Each laugh seemed to linger longer than the sound itself, echoing softly against brick walls and frosted windows, leaving a faint warmth in its wake. The laughter was not carefree. It was tempered by the weight of hunger, illness, and cold. Yet, its presence reminded families of resilience, of the human ability to find light even in darkness. Children's eyes sparkled as they shared small triumphs, a successfully formed snowball, a story well told, a small gift received at the charity kitchen. Adults, momentarily softened by amusement, allowed smiles to break the tension etched across weary faces, letting shared mirth fill the small spaces of their homes. The echo of laughter traveled beyond rooms, blending with the soft hum of cold stoves, the crackle of firewood, and the distant tolling of church bells. In alleyways and courtyards, it mingled with the fog and frost, creating tiny pockets of warmth and vitality that seemed almost tangible against the oppressive chill. Even brief, fleeting laughter served as a reminder that life endured, that joy could exist even in hardship, and that hope was not extinguished by frost or famine. Families treasured these moments quietly, tucking the memory of a smile, a chuckle, or a shared story deep into the heart. They became mental talismans against the cold stories to revisit in quiet moments beside the hearth, or whispers shared under blankets in the still of night. In the frozen city, laughter, though fragile and fleeting, became a gentle light, guiding Londoners through the darkness of winter, reminding all who heard it that even in struggle, life held tenderness and fleeting beauty. As the long frozen nights of 1895 began to give way to the faint light of dawn, London slowly awakened under a pale, silvery sky. The frost still clung stubbornly to cobblestones, windows, and rooftops, but the first glimmers of sunlight promised the possibility of warmth, nourishment, and renewed strength. The city seemed to exhale, its streets stirring with the cautious rhythm of life resuming after yet another night of endurance. Families emerged from tenements, faces pale but determined, carrying the few possessions that had helped them survive the night: bundles of firewood, scraps of bread, or warm blankets. Children's laughter, once muffled by sleep and cold, now rose softly over icy lanes, mingling with the distant calls of street vendors opening for the day. The frozen Thames reflected the dim gold of morning light, and soot-streaked chimneys released thin trails of smoke, signaling that hearths were alive, and the city's pulse continued. The hardships of the night were not forgotten. Cold fingers and toes, hunger, and fatigue were carried quietly in the movement of bodies and the careful gestures of caretakers. Yet with dawn came a subtle shift, renewed hope, the promise of shared warmth, and the knowledge that each day survived was a triumph of resilience. Neighbors greeted one another with cautious smiles, sharing brief words of encouragement, tips for stretching coal, or news of charity kitchens opening for those in need. Inside tenements, fires were stoked once again, meals prepared, and blankets adjusted. The rhythm of survival resumed with gentle persistence, each movement measured yet infused with the quiet optimism that comes with morning light. Even amid frost, fog, and scarcity, life pressed forward, steady, enduring, and deeply human. The dawn of hope in frozen London was a reminder that survival was never solitary. It was shared, nurtured, and strengthened by small acts of care, moments of laughter, and the enduring warmth of family and community. The Victorian poor, though battered by frost and hardship, faced each new day with quiet courage, proving that even the harshest winters could not extinguish the human spirit. Thank you for journeying through the frozen streets of Victorian London with me. As the frost melts in the warmth of your mind, let the quiet resilience, small joys, and enduring hope of these stories guide you toward peaceful rest. Remember the courage and tenderness found even in hardship, and let it comfort you as you drift into sleep. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know where you're watching from, whether the US, Europe, or other corners of the world, and what time of day you enjoy these tales. Your support helps keep these stories alive, and I look forward to sharing many more quiet journeys with you. Good night, and may your dreams be gentle and warm.